Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another CEN seminar. This is actually our final CEN seminar of this term. So thank you so much for joining us. And we are finishing with a bang with Dr. Maureen Ruby. So I met Maureen at Imbes, and we had an absolutely fantastic conversation about sort of reforming the way that we think about neuroscience and the way that neuroscience is incorporated into training courses and such. So Maureen is going to be telling us about her concept of the NeuroCompass today. And Maureen is the Isabel Farrington Endowed Chair in Social, Emotional and Academic Leadership, Director of the Centre of Excellence for Belonging and Leadership, and an Associate Professor in the Farrington College of Education and Human Development at Sacred Heart University. Maureen has a long career in education. She's been a classroom teacher, a literacy consultant, Director of Professional Learning, Director of Special Education and Pupil Services, and an Assistant Superintendent of Schools. She's also an invited member of UNESCO's Global Alliance on the Science of Learning and the Education Collaboratory at Yale's Science Summit, and serves on several boards. She has dedicated her professional career to supporting educators and students through teaching, research, and service. So I will hand over to you now, Maureen, and we shall hear more about your work.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen. We practice this, so let's see if practice makes perfect. Okay, I think we've got it.
Looks good.
So thank you so much for welcoming me here. I just want to say that I was playing around with AI and Claude created this little image here of the NeuroCompass. You learned a little bit about me. I just want to also say that I wasn't always in education. I started out as a dentist, and through a series of life happenings, could not practice anymore. Your hands need to work to do that. And I decided that I would go into education because I'd always been teaching along the way when I was in graduate school. And as a dentist, a doctor should be a good teacher of patients. And so I went into education. I also want to acknowledge that there's a diverse audience here, and I have an appreciation for the diversity of systems globally and the culturally appropriate approaches in different places to teacher preparation and educational leadership. And so I appreciate that you're all here. The first thing that I'd like to do before I launch into this is ask you if, in one word, you could tell me what comes to mind when you hear educational neuroscience, and just pop that into the chat. And Astrid, if you could call those out as they come in, because I'm not seeing the chat right this moment.
Yeah, I can do that. Well, the one that comes to mind for me is making usable knowledge for teachers. I know that's not one word, but
that's okay.
Usable knowledge. Gwen has put learning. Randy McDonald has put pedagogy. Let's see if any more come in. Christine Lawson's put the brain.
And so I would say that when I say educational neuroscience initially to folks, they would just look at me like I was off. And when I first came to my university and we were developing our doctoral program in social, emotional, and academic leadership, I really felt that we should have a full course in educational neuroscience because it is really the compass for everything that we do. I just want to also disclose that I have a lot of slides I'm going to go through very quickly. You'll get the handout for this presentation, but I just wanted to make sure that because of the diversity in the audience, that if there wasn't, if anybody didn't have a background in the basics of educational neuroscience, that you would have this in your handout. But I'm taking the position that we really need in education, no matter what level we're at, to understand that we need to have a sense of belonging before we can get into learning and teaching. And so students actually learn best when they feel psychologically safe and connected. And on the top, you see default mode network, salience network, and executive control network. These systems are all working together. And in the neuroscience of belonging, which is the foundation of learning, it's not a nice to have. In the United States, belonging is a word that's being thrown around almost ad nauseum. It's not a nice to have. It isn't an appetizer before a main course of learning. It actually is the learning. And social connection and the processing that we do to learn, the cognitive processing, are codependent. Now, some people will say that you need to have Bloom's before you can have Maslow, but in this visual that you see here for cognitive processing and learning, while we have to deal and know about attention and perception and memory and the whole list of things, when you get down to the bottom of that funnel, you can see the importance of social cognition and learning and emotions and learning. And so the basics of belonging and learning, lie in what we know about the limbic system. If we don't have a sense of belonging and safety, that amygdala is like on overload. And the belonging isn't just about having the motivation to engage in learning. The brain actually becomes more capable of learning. And what I really want to focus on is that every single interaction that we have in education, whether you are working with students in a preschool, kindergarten, lower elementary level, all the way up to doctoral programs with the dissertation defense, these are all belonging events and learning events. And so the other thing I want to point out, excuse me, before we go into the work that I've done, is that this need to belong and have connection transcends cultures. Whether you come from an individualistic culture or collective culture, collectivist culture, belonging and connection are central. So belonging can be contagious at the neurological level. And we know about this from our work with mirror neurons, emotional contagions, and the concept of collective efficacy in education, and social learning acceleration, how groups with strong belonging, whether it's in education or in business or in healthcare, these groups do better than isolated individuals. And so some of the work that I go to when I'm engaged in my work is that of Eric Carter. And Eric Carter developed this image, this framework for belonging. And he states that there are domains of belonging. And if you look at the image that has the brighter colors, this is the current level of, or the current status of this belonging wheel. I have resources and references at the back of the presentation, so you can connect to this. I think this is really worth looking at. On the website, which is a government-funded research website, this TIES belonging tool, this Carter belonging tool, each one of these dimensions are broken out, and there's a wealth of information. What I want you to notice is the original one, which is in the what I would call duller colors. And what you can see on here is there is a difference. There's, in the original version, Carter had loved as a dimension of belonging. But in the current version, loved has disappeared. And so in October of 2017, Carter presented at Boston College, and he was going over this wheel, and I'm going to read this. I don't mean to insult you, but I think this is important. He's going through the wheel, and he gets to the end, and he says, and that leads us to our 10th dimension of belonging, and that, of course, is love. And if you're worried that a social scientist is about to lecture on love, don't worry, I'm not. You don't need me to explain what love has to do with belonging. But some of you might know the work of Wolf Wolfensberger. He was a pioneer in our field and an advocate for people with disabilities and talked about the principle of social role valorization. And he offered the observation that healing for wounded people with disabilities begins with three messages: that you're valuable, that you are as valuable as any other person, and that you're loved by those around you. And as Henry Nguyen reminds us, what lies among all of our deepest questions is that question of, is there anyone who loves me? And so love is a place where we can step in uniquely to promote belonging. And when I've talked to him and met with him and asked him, really, why did you change this wheel? It was because the concept of having love on something that was used in education just really wasn't very well accepted. And he was kind of pushed into changing. But I think that when we ask people why they teach, they tell us that they love teaching, they love their content, they love the students. And there's a joke, I don't know, some people don't find it funny, but there's memes that are made of this, that elementary teachers love the children, high school teachers love their content, and higher education people love themselves. People laugh when they hear that, but I think that the point is that love is at the basis of all that we do when we feel safe and engaged, and that's why we say we're passionate about our work. So along with that wheel is a tool, a belonging reflection tool. And I have used this in my work with schools, with my doctoral students, with parents. And it was originally designed by Carter for working with supporting teachers who support students with disabilities. But we have morphed this tool and used it for elementary schools, high school athletics. Our teachers in our doctoral program and our master's program have used it in whatever context they happen to work in. And what this tool does is allows us to reflect on what kind of culture of belonging we have or don't have in wherever we work. And I highly recommend taking a look at this, because it's something that no matter what you're doing, if you're working in the area of education, or even I know that there are corporate entities that have taken this and morphed it to make it work for themselves because they want to have a culture of belonging. But it takes each of the dimensions and describes it, and then asks the folks that are using the tool, what are we doing that's right in this area? Really, really well. And then what could we be doing better or differently? And as you go through the 10 dimensions and you get to the end, this is where you prioritize what would you do, and in this case, it's for education. What actionable steps should you take to ensure that all students are experiencing belonging? And my recommendation is always, as you look through your data, what's the low-hanging fruit? What would be an easy win? Because people like to win, and it encourages and it really fosters collective efficacy when you're being successful. And then what are things that are really important that would be more difficult? Because if it's really important, we need to deal with it. So I share this with you because belonging is at the center of what we're talking about. And so how do we look at belonging? I said earlier that belonging is this sense of connection is from the very early stages all the way through higher ed. So how does this work in higher education contexts? And let's think about the idea of love and that love domain in an academic setting. And love in academic settings, not romantic love, that's not what we're talking about, but rather we're talking about profound care that makes transformational learning a possibility. And so ways that we in higher ed can professionally express love is in our intellectual generosity, our growth-oriented challenges with our students, letting them know that we believe in them, having protective advocacy for students and each other, recognition, genuine joy in what other people are succeeding in, and then our own modeling, being vulnerable ourselves. because we know what happens neurologically when we feel loved. And I have the bullets there. You know, our mirror neuron networks are activated. Our reward system, we could go into that whole dopamine cycle is activated. We are better at retaining information when our brain is in that state. And psychological safety really supports intellectual courage, which is what we're all about. So this universal framework from early childhood through higher education is critically important for us. We need to understand fundamental brain needs, cultural expressions, and professional love. And when I came into education, as I was sharing with Astrid, one of my misnomers, one of my biases was that I had been a dentist. And so I had 2 years in a medical school, dental school. We were all together. And we, you know, we dissected the brain. We had deep understanding of neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, learning. We had behavioral sciences. And I came into the educational profession with this background. And I have to admit, I never really considered the fact that other people didn't have this background and I was taking things for granted. So this gets into the neuroscience imperative, as I'm calling it, why teachers need to understand the brain. And this is from Pat Wolf in her book, Brain Matters. Teachers work in a laboratory, and that laboratory is a classroom. And so when I think about this, how could we have our educators going into classrooms when everything they do is targeted on the brain, yet we don't teach them anything about it? I tell my students that in showing them fMRI studies that we actually change when we are teaching brain function and architecture. We don't need scalpels. We don't need lasers. We change brain by our teaching. And so it would behoove us to know a little bit about the brain. And so as brain changers, teachers need to know about neuroscience. They need to have a level of neuroscience literacy. They're brain architects. Everything happens in the brain. So my premise is that neuroscience is absolutely essential. It's not optional. If you have a teacher who doesn't understand anything about how the brain functions, that would be like sending your car to somebody who doesn't know anything about an engine in a car, if that's where your problem was. And harnessing the power of our own neuroplasticity is a responsibility for those of us who are working with brains from early childhood all the way into adulthood. And so I pulled up these 5 reasons why I think we should ensure that our educators are well-versed in the foundations of neuroscience. Teachers have like tacit knowledge. It's amazing when they find out the reason why. Understanding neuroscience really aids in understanding neurodiversity and how and why we need to make accommodations and adjustments. In our country, as I'm sure in yours, there's stress is a big deal. And the impact of toxic stresses and what students and adults, teachers in the classroom are going through is hard to understand if we don't have any understanding of neuroscience. And we need teachers to understand that behavior is a form of communication. Additionally, the role of the brain in working memory and how students are performing in the classroom. And then there's a lot of work that I'd love to go into, but we don't have time on technology and its impact on the brain. And I'm a fangirl, if I could use that term, of Marianne Wolf and her work, which I think is powerful information for all of us, and would love to talk with people about that at another time. So then we have leaders in school. And I think another imperative is this leadership imperative, transforming our educational leaders and how they do their jobs through neuroscience training. And so why do school leaders need to understand brain science? I don't know if anybody's been a classroom teacher. I have. It's really, I would say, to be polite, annoying to have somebody coming in and evaluating you when they know nothing about what you do. And as leaders, we are, having been an assistant superintendent of schools, we make decisions all the time. And every single decision, every policy that we make is eventually going to trickle down to our distal learner, the student. And so we need to know how the decisions that we're making affect brain development. I alluded to just a second ago about teacher evaluation. We can't evaluate what we don't understand. Because we're in charge of supporting systems, maintaining systems, we need to make sure that the systems that we create in schools are brain-friendly systems, and we need to know about trauma-informed practices to it so that we can support those students who are at risk and be able to support teachers in early identification. So when leaders don't know what they don't know, there are a variety of issues that transpire. One uninformed leader affects hundreds and hundreds of teachers over the years that he or she is in that role, and thousands, potentially thousands of students. We will misallocate our resources. We'll buy the next shiny thing that is presented to us. We will have missed opportunities for ourselves, for our teachers, and for students if we don't understand brain development and the stages that students are going through, and the neuroplasticity and the windows of opportunity. And we will end up not being able to support teachers and end up with staff frustration. In our country, we have a teacher shortage, so we need to really take care of our teachers and support our teachers because they're in short supply these days. So here I was at a university with this background and this belief system, and I was asked to teach a course in our leadership certification program. And I just looked at the syllabus and I said, there's no way that I can be involved in this course. However, I'd be willing to revise it. And so what I did was it was a course it was called Advanced Curriculum. Wasn't quite sure what Advanced Curriculum was, but it was a curriculum development course for leaders. And I decided that I was going to incorporate neuroscience throughout. And these are very wordy slides, but I've just highlighted in blue how everything that was in these are the NELP standards, are our leadership standards, how everything in the course was going to be in the context of belonging, a culture of belonging, cultural responsiveness, and accessibility to resources for teachers, UBD, understanding by design, and neuroscience to promote success and well-being of all of our students. You can see neuroscience of learning, equitable access to diverse, culturally relevant academic resources. I'm just reading the buzzwords here. The course vision was also seated in neuroscience. What I wanted to do was, through the readings, lectures, etc., make sure that teaching and learning was centered in belonging, behavior, and critical areas that will be essential to student successes. Also to ensure that sorry. Sorry about that. That the instructional routines that the leaders would be supporting their teachers with would be founded in the neuroscience of learning. So I created modules, and you can see, I'm not going to read through these modules, but that in module 3, we were calling the leaders to take the stance of being cognitive contractors and looking at how brain functions and what they would need to do to ensure that students were going to be successful. And then in module 4, it was all about belonging. And we worked in that module with the wheel and that tool that I showed you. And at the end of the course, we asked these future educational leaders questions in a end of the course survey. And what I found, because some of my colleagues were a little hesitant about, maybe this was overkill, but here's what we found. Strongly agree for almost every one of these questions about whether neuroscience should be incorporated. You'll see that in the first question, it was about was this concept new to them? And you'll see that we had about 35% of either had taken cognitive science as an undergrad. I had 2 students among those many of the 77 who actually majored in cognitive science as an undergrad. But as you look at this data set, you can see that the second one, neuroscience has a place in educational leadership programs. 95% agreed with that. The infusion of neuroscience in this particular course was vital to their learning as a future leader. 90%. And so on. So I think these data are pretty convincing that the people who were aspiring leaders in this program felt that the neuroscience component of it was pretty important. And we had I was extremely impressed, as I hope you will be, with the open-ended responses. And I have 2 of them, which I'm providing you with, which are pretty lengthy. I was quite surprised that folks would take the type of time that it took, I don't know why this is flipping, to really pour their heart out onto this electronic survey. But you can see that, I'm going to read this part to you. The EDL 605 Advanced Curriculum class, with its intriguing neuroscience twist, definitely went beyond the typical curriculum design course, venturing into the fascinating realm of how the brain learns. And she goes on to say that she came into this thinking that it was a typical experience, but was armed with an understanding of the very terrain that she'd be guiding her students through, their brains. The most important aspect of this class wasn't just the curriculum design strategies themselves, but rather the powerful lens of neuroscience I used to examine them. By incorporating neuroscience, the class opened my eyes to the biological underpinnings of learning. I delved into how the brain forms connections, consolidates information, retrieves memories, and this knowledge transformed curriculum design from a theoretical exercise into a targeted approach that considers the neurological processes at play. And I apologize that this is jumping. And then she went on to say that her key takeaway was how impactful it would be to design curriculum elements that align with how the brain best absorbs information. And you'll have all this to review when you get the handout. This is another student who said that incorporating neuroscience as an aspect of the advanced curriculum course is of utmost importance. Neuroscience provides valuable insights. And this whole passage is all about her work with multilingual language learners. And I thought that this would be important for those of you who are interested to take a look at. It goes on to the next slide as well, because everything that she writes about is focused on multilingual learners. This is the end of hers. There were some shorter, this is a more typical response. And if you go through these, every single student's response was positive about how this really gave them knowledge that they didn't have before, and that how useful it would be. And critical was the open-ended, is there anything else you'd like to tell me about? And you can see it's imperative to have this. How did we not learn this before? This should be taught in pre-service classes. I believe that everybody, all educational preparation programs should include neuroscience, and on and on. It was pretty overwhelmingly positive. So the next thing was the SEL. Our doctorate is in social, emotional, and academic leadership. So these are folks who for the most part, are already school leaders, or they're leading school psychology departments or school social work departments. And this really requires that the students have, in order to go out and be successful and to lead schools and to lead organizations, that they have a neuroscience lens. So there are, in our educational doctoral program, we are committed to having students study pedagogy and leadership focus principles that are all centered in social emotional learning. And there's an error there. We're trying to develop scholarly practitioners who can apply social emotional learning. And we also want these educational leaders to be able to engage with all the political, economic, and social forces that we contend with in schools. We had outcomes for this course that were all related to social emotional learning, belonging, and neuroscience. And we had a very basic brain anatomy, neuroanatomy, and neurophysiology module. And then we had an advanced course, an advanced module, where we used actual open source materials from the Duke Medical School, from their neurobiology course. And this course was followed by a second course, which was SEL Pedagogy and Practice. And this is where they were extending what they learned in the 704 class, which was based on themselves, looking at themselves, their own emotional intelligence, and now building it into how they would develop their own pedagogy and practice approaches for SEL in their wherever they end up. This was to deepen their understanding and to integrate social emotional learning into academics. So I've given you the modules information, belonging. We went into belonging in a much deeper way in this course. And then we had a survey. And so remember, the first survey that I showed you was with students who were in a leadership program. These are our doctoral students. And once again, it was overwhelming, and we have more data coming in, that these strongly agree and agree responses were up in the high 80s to 90s when you combine them. And we asked questions here about, so you're at this stage, what do you think about having neuroscience as a basis for pre-service teachers, students who are in college wanting to be educators? And overwhelmingly, they felt that neuroscience has a place in all educational leadership preparation programs. It has a place in their doctoral program, and it's important for pre-service education programs. And they were able to say that this is my understanding of neuroscience, and the application of my learning from these courses has influenced my professional work already. 93%. So what we did in these courses is we made all of the teaching, which typically could be very theoretical, but we made it actionable. We made sure that the tasks that the students were doing in the modules were applicable to their work site, and that they were very actionable. So their open-ended responses, which you will have, were essentially in line with what we got from the leadership students, overwhelmingly so. I gave you several of these to read. And that brought me to something that I need to tell you is near and dear to my heart. I think that parenting and collaborating with parents is an absolute essential component of what we do in education, and we also oftentimes give it lip service. So I have to tell you honestly that my own personal biases going into this influenced how I was thinking when I prepared this coursework for parents. I wrote a grant for a compassionate parenting program, which would really entail four meetings throughout the course of a year with parents of under-resourced children to talk to them about compassion and parenting skills. And the objectives were to really enhance the social emotional skill set of elementary students who were in an out-of-school time program with a focus on empathy, compassion, and kindness, and then simultaneously be working with the parents in these 4 workshops that were designed to help them become more compassionate parents. And what I really wanted to do was have consistency across the out-of-school time program experience that the students were getting and the home environment, using the same language and exposing the parents to a lot of what the students were learning in this program. The out-of-school time program meets 6 weeks full day from like 8 to 4 in the summertime, and then it meets once a week or twice a week, depending on the students, throughout the school year after school. So this was the book that we were using with the children. If you don't know this book, it's quite dear. And the story is not about a kitten, and it's really not about a kitten, even though the kitten was the main character of the story, but it's really about the importance of community and compassion and generosity. And so all of the students in this program, I think at the time there were about 183, K through 8, got a copy of this book, and we did lessons with the book. For the parents, we had sessions. The first one was on compassionate parenting and brain development, and this is where I need to confess that I was somewhat biased going in. When I developed this first session, I would call it Neuroscience Super Duper Light. I really just didn't think that, number one, the parents would be interested, and I worried about the vocabulary and the language and overwhelming them. But some of the things that I did do in that particular session was talk a little bit about the limbic system and the idea of, when your limbic system, which is the thumb, is activated, your cortex, which is the outside of your hand, flips, you flip your lid, and you're working out of this part of the brain that is really full of emotions. And I used a Cookie Monster video where Cookie Monster does this really great job of demonstrating what it's like to try to regulate your emotions and your desires. And I introduced the story, This is About a Kitten. The second module was on connecting with compassion, talking about how behavior is communication, being able to listen first and listen with empathy, and then talking about validating your kids' feelings and describing behaviors, not labeling children. The third session, I talked about mindfulness and Ruler. Ruler is something that comes out of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, and I provided the parents with some tools that they could use at their homes. We did mindfulness activities and practices, and I went over Ruler tools with the families. And then the fourth session was we had the author of that book Zoom in with us. And for the first part of the session, the students had developed interview questions and interviewed the author. And then the author did a parent presentation with questions and answers. So there were I did exit tickets with the parents after every session. And I call some of these some outcomes and some unanticipated outcomes. I'll use the term mind blown, neuroscience term. My mind was blown when, after the first session, because the parents, in talking to me and in filling out the documents by hand, 41% of them wrote down that they wanted to know how their child brains worked. 29 wanted to know more about their child's behavior being a way of communicating feelings. And then you can see the rest of the data. I was quite struck by their interest in neuroscience. When I asked them what else they wanted to learn about in an open-ended question, they were really getting, these questions are really getting at having a deeper understanding of how the brain works in response to what's happening in the environment and students feeling. And the other thing that was really quite anticipated was the fact that they knew that this was 4 sessions over the course of the school year, and they wanted them to be more frequently, and they asked, could they have them twice a month or even weekly, which totally surprised me. In the second session, they were still talking about learning more about the brain. We didn't really talk about the brain, but one of the things that they learned from today's session was the brain. They were making connections even though we weren't actually specifically talking about that. They were very interested in what they do and how they say it affects their children. And the other thing that was surprising was that I gave them handouts. I gave them the PowerPoint handouts. I gave them lots of handouts. And I was questioned over why was I giving them so much. But parents really felt that the handout materials helped them. This was not, they were not prompted to, how did you feel about the handouts? This was just a response that they gave. The questions that they have was, I thought this was really insightful. I want to know more about lessons that we can teach our kids when we come into situations, so that's when a child is acting out or something. How can we turn those into opportunities for a teachable moment? Well, that's getting at neuroscience. In session 3, I asked them which of the tools that we use that they like, and you can see the data. And I asked them why they chose the particular tool that they chose, you can see they're talking about communicating feelings, listening respectfully, regulating emotions, time to think and act appropriately. And then in session 4, these were just responses about the book and what the author shared about the use of children's books. So when I got all this information from parents, I really kind of had a breadcrumb trail. And it led me to believe that we need to have neuroscience as a foundation, whether we're working with parents or teachers or graduate students or ourselves in our work. And this has practical implications. So some of the things that I'm going to do, I've written 2 grants. Oh, another unexpected outcome with the parents was they wanted to know about supporting their students with AI. And what should they know about AI, because they're hearing about it and they don't want bad things to happen to their children. So 2 of the outcomes with parents were, one, I've written a grant to do a neuroscience series with focused on parents and parenting, and the other is an AI series for parents. But I do think that we need what I'm calling NeuroCompass toolkits for all of us. And so in these graphics, you can see what I put together here is, well, first of all, teachers, we need to help teachers understand and appreciate it, more than tacitly, that every interaction that they have with their students is a belonging event and a learning event, that those go hand in hand. And so there's a neuroscience reality that we have to be able to provide in instruction. We have to be able to prepare teachers to have daily practices that are brain-based. I'm thinking about this, my connection from the title and from what I talked about with Eric Carter and love in belonging, that, the act of teaching is love in action. And then there's a ripple effect that happens. One teacher who creates belonging can neurologically transform that whole community. So what are the tools that we need for teachers? That's something that I want to do. Administrators, we need a toolkit for administrators. And so we need to help our administrators really embrace the fact that they create the conditions for belonging that can flourish across that entire system. And so, we need systematic neuroscience introduced into how our administrators work. we need to provide them with some leadership practices that are brain-based and that can change brains in positive ways. And then because of the political role of administrators, they need to be the face to the community. And so how can they engage the community in ways that are meaningful and based in what we know about connection and brains? And then there's a multiplier effect. All of these decisions that administrators make create positive, hopefully, neurological conditions for literally thousands of developing brains in a school system. And then for parents, the home, where our children first are taught, is an actual laboratory for belongings. This is where our brains begin to learn. And so supporting parents in a toolkit, which is one of the grants that I just wrote, to have a neuroscience foundation to parenting, for them to understand co-regulation and attachment security and do it in a way that's culturally responsive. What are the brain-based practices that parents can engage in at home with our kiddos? That one important thing before, sit down and do your homework, a connection time before homework. Learning how to process praise in ways that are building students' self-esteem and belief, and not being helicopter parents or, I guess, lawnmower parents, but normalizing struggle that is part of learning, and then how to validate. And so the other thing is forming a relationship between parents and schools so that the parents can support what's going on with school belonging. And then reminding parents constantly that a child's brain develops in the context of a relationship and how important that relationship is. And that when you have a sense of belonging in your home, you are then developing a capacity for your child to be potentially more successful in belonging beyond the home. And then for us, we need to embrace, I think, that advanced learning, the type of learning that takes place in university, requires the highest level of psychological safety and intellectual belonging because it comes with very high risks. And so intellectual belonging is important. How do we optimize the prefrontal cortex contact of our students? And how do we do all this in a global context so that we're constantly building bridges among cultures? What are our mentorship practices with our students in higher ed? And, this, I think, needs to engage intellectual humility, graduated autonomy, like a gradual release of responsibility at a higher ed level. Embracing our students as co-creators of knowledge, and making sure that when people come to university that we're focusing on identity and ensuring that our students feel like they belong in the scholarly community that we have. When we look at our course design, how do our courses really communicate that we want to have a culture of belonging? Looking at our syllabi, looking at the way we provide feedback to our students, honoring the diversity and the different ways that people have of sharing their knowing, and then the importance of discourse, which I think is something that's being lost with everything that's going on in technology. And then back to this idea of not romantic, but professional love, and the way we mentor our students and co-mentor each other, where we're combining the intellectual rigor that is so critically important in our work, with this profound level of care that we have for our students as they are becoming the scholars who will create the tomorrows that we will leave as our legacy. And so for all audiences, we need to focus on the science, the heart, and the impact. And that NeuroCompass is really where I think neuroscience meets the human heart in the service of transforming education as we know it for the good of all. And so the takeaways that I think I can offer to you are that if we make small and intentional neuroscience-based changes, we can have a really huge impact on things. And all of the stakeholders that I've talked about will benefit from having a foundation of neuroscience and using that as a lens. And then supporting people to understand what would be appropriate practices that they could implement on a daily basis, whether they be a parent, a teacher, a leader, or an educator in higher ed. That we support at the very minimum the understanding of how neuroscience is central to us creating cultures of belonging, understanding co-regulation, mirror neurons, etc. Looking at policy that we develop and ensuring that it's a human-centered approach to policy. And then in the end, my goal would be, and my hope would be, that we all can experience belonging wherever we are, and a true sense of belonging, not just a buzzword, and that cultures of belonging, when based in neuroscience, can create the conditions that we need for learning, for leadership, and for love. So, what's your sphere of influence? What's one thing that you can do differently? Louis Cozzolino, in his quote from his book, he said, "Those who were nurtured best survive the best." So I want to thank you. And I really am indebted to Astrid and company for offering me the opportunity to be with you and to share this information with you. And so I thank you profusely, and I'm happy to answer any questions. The next 2 slides, as you'll see, you'll get this, or 3 slides, have my contact information and the references.
Well, that was absolutely fantastic, Maureen. Thank you so much. I literally
thank you.
just took a screenshot of your final slide there with all the papers and everything. Maybe you might want to. I think we've lost your slides. I don't know if you want to put them back up so people can look at that again.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna give you this as a
Oh, you're going to
handout to
give them
send
out.
out. Yes, absolutely.
That's fine. That's great. Yeah, but I just want to say, first of all, just congratulations, like the incredible amount of work that you've done and really the quality, that you've done, and the interconnectedness of all of it, the multiple levels that you've worked at, I think is just phenomenal. So there are a couple of questions in the chat, but I'd like to start with one. And it's kind of hard to pick because I've got like half a dozen questions here that I could ask. But I think I'll stick with something that really fits with what you're talking about, because I often see in education there's kind of a disconnect between emotion and learning. You sort of are taught to put your emotions to one side, but if you're working from a neuroscience perspective, learning is an emotional experience. Activation of the limbic system is very much a key part of learning, and in a real sort of practical and basic sense, you learn better if you're enthusiastic, and happy and calm. And it's very difficult to learn if you're worried or afraid or sad, or, it's sort of linked to these different emotions. So, if we want to really incorporate neuroscience into learning, we have to embrace the idea that emotions are embedded into learning. And I wondered if over the course of all these courses that you've done, do you have any thoughts on this and how to kind of help practitioners and parents embrace that emotions are a key part of the learning experience?
That was a lot, Astrid. Well, I think that what has been really, well, first of all, I know this is going to sound maybe a little quirky, but I found that with teachers, leaders, and not this parent group, but some other parents that I tested this out on, showing them, and this is from the reading research, fMRI pictures of students who have a reading disability before they get treatment. And then pictures of those fMRI scans of those students 6 to 8 weeks, 12 weeks, depending upon the study, after, and showing them the difference in brain that was related to the instruction.
Mhm.
And that is powerful, because what do we say, seeing is believing. And just to start the conversation that that the brain is neuroplastic, the brain changes, and the changes are influenced by what we do in the environment, what we instruct. And then it depends on the audience that you're talking to. But with parents, parents are, and quite frankly, I wish I knew this better when I was a parent. I would have been a better parent. But understanding that just the way you talk to your children influences their brain. And the other thing with parents is when they understand, and all I did was that flip your lid. I mean, I know a lot of you are familiar with that. Just that little video. I mean, it's a quick, I think I have the link in the slides. That was enough to help them understand that when their kids are acting out, that it's not an act of defiance. It's not an intentional act, that this is biologically, neurologically based. And that if we can appreciate, even for a moment, because it's upsetting, that when a child is having a tantrum or even lashing out at us or calling us names, that we need to step back and not take that personally. This also happens with us as teachers in school. When we have that child who had a, I'll call it traumatic experience at home, and then they come into the classroom and they carry that with them. I have found that teachers want to do what's right by kids. And when they can understand just about the cortisol cycle and how cortisol levels go up and then come down, but they don't come back down to baseline when you are in a constant trauma state, which unfortunately there were way too many people that are living that life. And that and I use an example, I'll say, so, Johnny is sitting in his desk and Johnny has had all these horrible, terrible things, which, pick one, what's happening at home over and over and over and over and over again, right? And so their cortisol level does not come down to baseline. They're on high alert, at all times. And you were just walking by their desk and you happen to trip over something and you kind of brush up against the side of their arm. Now, if this is a kid who is beaten or abused at home and you brush by them and then they alarm and they pick up a water bottle or something and throw it across the room, that is not an evil, wicked person who intentionally tried, this is how I'm going to think about it,
Yeah.
tried to harm somebody. That doesn't mean it's okay. So let's be clear about that. That doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be dealt with. But we need to really think about the why. What is happening in the brain and what's happened in the past that's caused that brain to be like that, that this
Yeah.
is the behavior. What is it communicating? And so then we can be we need to be responsible for everything else that's going on in the classroom and all the other students, et cetera, et cetera. And there needs to be accountability. But first, we need to think about how are we going to get to the why, the root cause, and support that person. And I think that just spills over into parenting as well. I mean, I can take this a step further and talk about, I was in a book club. I've got so many books here, I can't tell you what the exact name of it is, but it's about cheating, and it's on it's on AI, and it's really interesting. So Why do students do the things they do? Neuroscience. You can't get away from it. You just can't get away from it. It's trying to understand what is in the mind that either impedes progress of an individual person in their journey, or fosters their success on their journey. I
Mhm.
probably didn't answer your question, Astrid, but thanks for letting me
No,
talk.
no, you did. No, absolutely. It's so it sounds to me like it's about, communicating these core concepts and sort of scaffolding them, with things that parents and educators can relate to.
Mhm.
That's what I'm sort of taking from that anyway. I just want to double check because we are a couple of minutes past 5. Are you
Oh,
okay to
sorry.
stay like, no, are you
Oh,
okay to stay like 5 more minutes and answer a
oh,
couple of
absolutely.
questions?
It's only noon here.
There we go. Excellent. I just wanted to double check too, so that we weren't running you over time. So Andy has a couple of questions. His first question is that he'd like to know a bit more about this concept of universal brain needs and culturally appropriate expressions. I think that might have been something you shared near the start.
Oh, yes. So, what I was referring to about that, and I can share information on it, is that we, when we are working with a group of people and students, and we have the community that I was describing that I work with is a very diverse community, and the majority of the schools in this particular area are from, I would say, under-resourced communities. But we need to think about the fact that it's under-resourced is one thing. The fact that these people have resources is another thing. They may not have financial resources, but they come from so many different places and they have cultural resources. They
Mm.
also have a lot of experiences that are positive, that can add to the community. And so we need to be thinking about that. While somebody doesn't have money, doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of other assets to share. And with that, we also need to understand that the way they respond to things, are cultural differences. There are, whether somebody looks at you directly or they look away from you, these are cultural differences. And we could talk, you spend a whole week on a cruise. Let's go on a cruise and talk about cultural differences. But it doesn't matter when we're talking about the concept of belonging and universal brain needs. So the universal need that I'm talking about is this connection and this sense of belonging, and that transcends cultures.
Yeah, that
If
makes
that
perfect sense. Yeah.
if that answers Andy's question.
That to me that makes perfect sense, but Andy obviously leave another comment if it doesn't. So Andy's second question says so he says, I'm not seeing the clear connections between care, compassion, co-regulation on one hand and mindfulness on the other. So the former being about social connectedness, how does mindfulness relate to connection and belonging?
Well, so um when we have so I'll give the parent example. So we talked about mindfulness with the parents and practiced mindfulness strategies and exercises, because when you're in the heat of the moment with your child, we talked about something called the meta moment. The meta moment is literally that, realizing that in this, it could be co-regulation, the child's escalating, you're escalating, okay, and you need to recognize that that's happened, and then take a meta moment, and then go into mindful breathing or whatever strategy you pick, so that you calm your nervous system down and you're better positioned to connect with the child. And one of the things that, so we taught these things to the children in the out of school program, and kids are great. So we talked about meta moments, and how when you feel this in your body, you need to step back. You need to go through whichever mindfulness strategy you're going to select, and so this little girl, they can take it and they can misconstrue it. She came back to the out of school time program, and she went up to our director and she said, "Oh, miss, you'll be so happy. I used what we learned in school today." And she goes, "Yeah, so she was having an altercation of some sort with the teacher." Now remember, this is like a fourth grader, so she's like 9 or 10 years old. And she said, when she said, "So I took a meta moment and I started doing my counting. I was doing a 1, 2, 3, 4 breathe. And I'm looking at my teacher and she said, she said, I looked at her and I said, you need to lose that face and take a meta moment." So instead of like just doing it for herself, she's like, she could have gotten herself into a lot of trouble, but she turned it back on the teacher because she's thinking, I did it, you should do it too. And so, we had to have a talk with her saying, well, we're not going to tell other people how to do this. But she calmed herself down, and we are of the belief, because of, what we read in the literature and what we see in practice, that mindfulness and connection are complementary. We can connect better when, even if two people are having an argument, if you're both able to stop that negative interaction, take a step back, and engage in a calming activity, you have a better chance of being able to re-enter that relationship. And for this concept of the meta moment, in some families that are in the school system where I was an assistant superintendent, we implemented that whole ruler strategy from Yale. And we had families that created, like we have sometimes quiet or calming corners in school, created areas in their home, just like a table or a pillow or something, where when they did these activities with their children, kids were able to know, could feel, could recognize when they were losing it, and could go and take a meta moment in that quiet area and do these mindfulness activities and then come back to it.
It makes perfect sense when you explain it like that. They're complementary, as you say. So we've got a couple more questions, and then I think we will wrap it up. So Sarah asked, I actually think this is a really important question. So she says, in my institution, we try to incorporate some of what you presented in the pre-service teacher education, but some teacher educators say, we're not neuroscientists. How can we expect it to teach this? And I think this is something that happens a lot. So I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
So I'm going to give you, I'm going to send you, Astrid, a website. We're not asking teachers to be neuroscientists. We're asking them to be humans.
Yeah.
This is part of humanity. However, with the appropriate training, we can teach teachers enough. They're smart people. And when they see the connection between understanding neuroscience and the outcomes, when you have strategies that are neuroscientifically based, the outcomes on students, it's absolutely amazing. There is a school district, it's called the Mineola School District in New York. I will send you the link. They are the most generous colleagues you could ever want to meet, because they have developed from pre-K through grade 12 an entire curriculum that's based in neuroscience. I've visited there. I was in a preschool classroom where the teacher actually had this really cool hat. It looked like her brain. It looked like she didn't have any skull, that she ordered from Amazon. But more importantly, what she was doing, she had these little 4-year-olds, and they were all up on the carpet in their little squares. And when I walked in, on their tables, there were white papers that were under plastic, and they were in the outline of the brain, and there was like different colored clay on places. So this is my first entry in here. And the children were on the carpet, like I said, standing, and the teacher started singing. Don't ask me to sing the song, but they do have the song on the website. And she was singing about the cerebellum, and they were doing yoga poses, and they were doing the tree pose. That's when you're on one foot and your foot is on your knee and you're standing like a tree. And they were singing about the cerebellum and balance and all of this other stuff. When they were done, they came back and she instructed them, and now take your green clay and mold it into the shape of the cerebellum and put it where it goes on the brain. So, like, you may say, this is crazy. This was not crazy, because they start at at pre-K, and they're learning about, in very developmentally appropriate ways. Kids will learn any vocabulary word you sing to them, basically. And they, throughout this entire school district, every single grade, they incorporate brain science, and they have the most engaging short clip videos to teach these principles. 3 minutes. It looks like it was done in Hollywood or Bollywood, and it was done right in this school district. And the SEL and the academics are integrated. Their entire way of assessing children is learner-centered. It's amazing. So I'm going to write it down so I don't forget, but I'm going to send you this link, because everything that they've created is yours.
Yeah, that's great. No, thank you, Maureen. Essentially, it is very possible.
Yeah.
It's possible to communicate all of this in simple,
And,
accessible
and
ways. Yeah.
I will say to Sarah that initially I think it's scary. It's like, oh, you want me to know this? But when you do it in a very judicious and you create a culture of belonging in your higher ed classroom, and then you can show, I think you need to show direct connections. They become empowered.
Hmm.
And the same results that I got, whereas, like, why didn't I learn this before? It's the people who are already in the classroom will have that response. It's been like universal for us. But when the pre-service teachers are getting that ahead of time, if you can show them, when I get my papers published, that people who didn't have this wish they had it, because it helps you understand why you're designing certain lessons. And two of the books that I have on the reference, one that is you'll see there's two textbooks, and I use them they're the easiest reads, they're the most student-friendly books, and they definitely make this make sense. The Understanding by Design and Neuroscience. And there's another person who I didn't put on my list because I didn't talk about her work, but Willis is she was a neuroscientist who became a teacher, and she does an awful lot of work on talking about the parallel between video gaming and teaching strategies. Because video gaming, just like marketing and all these other industries, they use neuroscience. And
Yes.
why do we have a child who we say has ADHD or XYZ LMNOP, throw a couple more letters in there, and they can't focus? Yet that same child will sit with a device for hours.
Mm.
And it's because the video games use the principles of neuroscience in their development. They don't hit them with something that they can't do. They give them something that's doable. And then
Yeah.
immediately they praise them. They don't take them to a toy store or out for ice cream. They just give them a little confetti on a screen. And that sets up the dopamine release cycle. And then they scaffold everything they do. They give them hints. They don't let them fall. They give them immediate responsive feedback. And so they'll stay with that forever. And so why can't we understand how the brain works, come to understand that, and then use strategies that align? Because
Yeah.
with the dopamine cycle, that's how people get addicted to drugs and alcohol and sex and anything else you can become addicted to. Well, I say, and some people get offended, and I don't mean to offend anybody, if people who sell drugs know how to get you addicted to drugs, it's free at first, and then and then you can't live without it. Why can't we get kids addicted to learning by using the principles of neuroscience in our teaching?
Yeah.
I know that
Yes.
I hope I didn't offend anybody by
No,
making that correlation, but
It's super interesting. And like you say, these games and such are designed around these principles at the end of the day. But yeah, I'll just finish off with Randy's question. So Randy says he's a high school teacher, and he just skimmed your paper, Professional Development Schools and Future Teachers of America Clubs, Promising Pipeline. And he just wondered, how can this research be applied to preparing high school students?
Oh, that's interesting as well. I think that we used to have a commercial for Jello, and there's always room for Jello. Well, there's always room for teaching students about this, and I think that I did a talk with a group of middle school teachers. Uh, it was in April actually, and we talked about how understanding neuroscience as middle school helps us like middle school is like some people love it and some people can't stand it in terms of educators because it's such a volatile time. So there's so many changes going on in these students. And so that's really, really important for understanding what their physical changes are and their cognitive changes are. And neuroscience is at the base of that. So by teaching middle school and high school students about their brain, it helps them understand themselves and they don't feel broken because a lot of the stuff that they're going through is typical. So in answer to this question, using neuroscience to support teachers in terms of their curriculum development, instruction, and assessment, while you're doing that, teaching the students at the same time. So you're co-creating, I think is something that's totally doable. And they're very interested, kids in that age bracket, the 12 to 15-year-old age bracket, they're very interested when they learn about dopamine release and oxytocin and things that we think like why would they want to know? They're super interested. So how can you integrate that into whatever, I don't know what your curriculum is, but into science classes, into have it be a reading, have it be these Dr. Willis has short articles, like more like blogs that would be perfectly applicable. If you had a gaming club, I don't know, some schools have gaming clubs and coding clubs and whatnot. You could do it in a club rather than in a class. I think that I love to talk about this stuff because especially if more people than me were talking, because when you put heads together and people start like pontificating about all the options, it's amazing what we can come up with for what we can do.
Mm. No, that's great. Thank you so much, Maureen. And Randy, I hope that helps you guide your practice. Oh, and Sarah says thank you, and she's found your presentation very useful.
Oh,
So
you're
that is
welcome.
excellent. She's going to share it with a group of teachers. So that's excellent. Um,
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Yes, and we will try and share Maureen's resources with you as soon as possible. But yeah, no, we will wrap it up there. So thank you so much, Maureen. Thank you again. I mean, your
Thank
work
you.
is just fabulous, in my opinion.
Thank
So
you.
yes, that is our final CEN seminar for the season. So I hope you all have a lovely summer, and I hope to see you here again back in the autumn. So once again, thank you, Maureen. Thank you, everyone, for
Thank
coming.
you. I'll send you that stuff, Astrid. Thank you so much,
Brilliant.
folks.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Maureen. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.